Welcome everyone, Questine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3, Shadows of Change. Creative Assembly has made the point very clear that they are going to add more content to Shadows of Change. Now, hopefully, they will also add some much needed fixes, in particular for the races affected by Shadows of Change. And it would also be nice to get an auto-resolve change as well. Maybe that's an idea they're toying with. Don't know. But let's talk about Kislev. What does Kislev need? What does Stankia need? Well, maybe a new starting position would be useful for Stankia. But I want to focus on Kislev as a race because out of the 3 races in the DLC, Kislev is arguably in the worst position. While Kairos is certainly worse off than any of the Kislev legendary lords, Tzeentch between Kairos and the Changeling is not necessarily quite as horrible, because Kislev is not great regardless of the legendary lord you're playing, whereas Tzeentch can be pretty good to play, very powerful to play at the very least, if you're going with the Changeling. So I'd consider them in the worst position. So what are the things that they could add? Well, one of the things people have talked about is a magic lord over here, specifically a hag lord that would be available to Kislev. Maybe something exclusive to Stankia, or maybe just something you do have access to. Of course, the problem is that if you do add the Hag Lord, then the Ice Witch Lords suddenly become less relevant. Another thing to mention would be the addition of a new magic type in the lore of Hags. That would also be something that quite a lot of people would like access to. But the issues for Kislev are not necessarily because they are lacking in terms of the unit roster or lord roster. Well, certainly not having hags for Stankia and her using boyars is ridiculous. There's some bigger issues for Kislev. I would also have to say that Stankia not having patriarchs for a very significant portion of her campaign and her starting on the other side of the planet is a problem. Because patriarchs, one of the few good things about Kislev, or one of the strengths that Kislev has, is that they have patriarchs, they can get a lot of them, they can get a good amount of casualty replenishment. Here's the thing though, when it comes to the unit roster. It's generally strong, but one of the things that Kislev does lack is a kind of early game artillery to knock down walls. While little Groms are powerful, from the perspective of wall-knocking artillery, they are tier 4 units. And I really think Creative Assembly needs to accept the reality that their game, the way it's designed, it's very focused on the early game. Without having good siege capability, you're not going to do very well. And you can say, oh, you can build rams and towers, you can use ladders. That's not a great siege strategy. What you do as Kislev with siege is you get a lot of Kossars, you break down the walls with your lord, you kill everything with your ranged units one at a time. Playing sieges in Warhammer 3 is pretty awful. That's one of the things that they should improve on with Shadows of Change, with the improvements they're going to add in February. But the fundamental problems of Kislev come down to 2 things. Or rather 3 things. The supporter system is garbage, the invocation system is garbage, and that does mean devotion as a system is pretty awful as well. With the invocation, basically the situation is pretty simple. When you're building supporters, you always go Urson. When you have supporters, you always go Dash. Because you can upgrade Dash to give you an elemental bear summon in every battle, and that 8% income from all buildings and 15% income from trade tariffs is certainly far more significant than what you can get from either Celiac or Tor. I mean, why would you bother with Celiac when you already have patriarchs? I mean, the growth you could consider a benefit, but it's not really an issue. Kislev is not necessarily lacking in growth. While their growth is not as good as other races, it's certainly there. It's pretty decent. So Celiac is meaningless. Tor is not necessarily so meaningless, but again, it's just not a great benefit compared to Dash. Like basically, yeah, Dash is far better than others unless you're building supporters, in which case you go to Urson. The system in itself is pretty crap overall, I would have to say. What's annoying is devotion costs increase the more territory you have, And you can't get devotion from people like the Skaven, which you should, or the Vampire Counts, or even the Greenskins, or the malevolent forces of Dryka. You should. I think, like, the invocations should have a flat cost, regardless of the amount of territory you hold, and they should be more powerful, one way or another. Or rather, the ones that aren't named Dash should have a reason to it. And screw the supporter system, because if you're playing Catherine, like the problem with Catherine and Castalton is that they're the two worst campaigns to play as Kislev, because you just won't be able to confederate them. If you're playing a campaign as Boris Ursus, for instance, and I've made this point before, and I've played quite a bit of Kislev, if you're playing a campaign as Boris Ursus, yes, you can rush for Kislev, or you can rush for Archeon, take him out. But the benefit that is Boris Ursus and even Astankia, though Boris Ursus is substantially better than Astankia, because he has a much better economy than Astankia, even if Astankia has better individual armies, or Boris will just have more of those armies. But here's the thing about Boris. You can easily confederate, or far more easily confederate, the entirety of Kislev. That means you can get those special cities and all the benefits that do come from those cities. By the way, nice change that Creative Assembly has finally made, that they show you the different tiers of the landmarks that do exist in these settlements. I don't think that was even mentioned in the patch notes, I should point out. So now you can just look at the glance and see what the different tiers, including crucially the early ones, will give. That's significant. So invocations, supporters, lack of confederation. Like, I feel like Catherine and Castalton should be able to confederate each other from the very beginning of their campaign from diplomacy. That does mean you may lose out on the benefits of like getting a lot of supporters, but that should be a choice, just a perspective. Or if you do confederate other for diplomacy, you just get all the benefits from a lot of supporters. Also, the short campaign victory condition shouldn't require you to get 600 supporters, because fuck that. This is another problem. This campaign victory condition is actually powerful. The benefit is powerful, but it takes so long that it makes it a bit meaningless. Free hero capacity for Kislev is nothing to sneeze at. In particular, because of Frost Maidens, because the capacity for them is fairly limited in the campaign. Kislev was clearly made for a more limited campaign in Realms of Chaos. Mortal Empires is a different beast. But the biggest problem, by far, or the biggest problem is, one, Kislev as a territory just plain sucks. While the changes to provinces are welcome, I do feel Old World did it better, having the major cities of Kislev tied into the provinces, as opposed to being their own separate provinces. Does add a good amount of power just from that. But on top of that, but beyond the territory being terrible, the economy of Kislev, which ties together with everything else, is also not that great. While you can get a lot from trade resources, you're going to spend up to 4,000 on an income building that only generates 300. So you're looking at an income building that costs 1,000 for 100 income. That is pathetic. That is genuinely one of the worst ratios of income you can have in the entire game. While some other races do share it, including Kairos and Nakari, if I'm not mistaken, it is fairly rare. Consider the Greenskins. They spend 250 for 250 at tier 1. And their income building doesn't go all the way to tier 5. So I think that these buildings should be condensed. They should be cheaper. Add strength to Kislev. Now, it's kind of interesting to think of the fact that Kislev can actually be annoying to deal with in the hands of the AI, because they don't have the same kind of economic limitations that you do with their massive upkeep. But playing Kislev is a genuine pain in the neck. There should be more income. The building shouldn't be as expensive. Like, maybe the farm estate should generate double the income. The barrels should be down to 3 buildings as opposed to 5. So yes, you could get a lot from trade resources as Kislev. Even if you keep the cost as it is, even if the cost was kept as it was, if you could just condense it to 3 buildings, it would make Kislev the genuine defender of the North, that it should be. That is my perspective on that. And yeah, gain more devotion from different sources. Those are the problems that Kislev has. A lot of people focus on hags, on missing chicken hut, all that. But Kislev is not great to play. Simple as that. The economic limitations makes it so that even in a campaign that you play, where you do well, it's not going to feel all that great to play Kislev. The limitations are real. It's not quite as bad as some other races, like the dwarves, who have limited post-battle income, because you can gain a lot of money post-battle as Kislev, but it's not great either way. Then we have Tzeentch, and I do mean both Kairos and the Changeling over here. The Changeling is certainly significantly better than Kairos the Fate Weaver to play a campaign as, but both of them do have their own issues, just of a different nature. For Kairos, the problems are his economy initially is very limited. It takes a lot of money to build it up. You can, and you do have a bunch of economic modifiers that can make that economy work pretty well. But it does take time and a lot of resources to do so. For the Changeling, the situation is a bit different, because as the Changeling, you can certainly generate a significant amount of money in your economy, largely through the mercantile illusion, because you increase the economy of the faction in whose territory you do have a trickster cult, and you then build this all the way to tier 3. You can be fairly rich. You won't compete with some of the richest factions on the campaign map, but you won't necessarily struggle for money besides the early game situation. So that is the Changeling state of affairs compared to Kairos. Another problem though with Tzeentch is casualty replenishment. For both Kairos and the Changeling, though the Changeling at least has a solution, Kairos does not. So as a Changeling, you do get 10% casualty replenishment from the very beginning of your campaign after turn 1, but even 10% is not great enough. There's something really broken with Tzeentch casualty replenishment. I believe it's down to the barrier. It means that casualty replenishment is a pain in the neck. Now you do have a way around this, and that's with the schemes, because you can get a scheme to eliminate eliminate the fecundites, and that will give you plus 10%. So with 20% is in a decent enough state, and you can keep getting more and more. You can get a significant amount of action effects through the schemes. Problems for both for the Changeling, however. For Kairos, it's really a question that boils down to his faction effects are now worth it. His faction is now worth it. His campaign is pretty awful to play. It's not that Kairos doesn't have power. He does. But it's like, if I want to play a campaign as Tzeentch, I can play Village or I can play the Changeling, and it's a vastly superior experience. Hell, I could play an undivided Legendary Lord of the Warriors of Chaos and make it and focus on getting the Tzeentch stuff, and it still would be a better Tzeentch campaign. While I wouldn't have as many demons, you don't want to go full demons in a Tzeentch campaign. You want a combination of Warriors of Chaos, Sangors, and then yes, some of the demonic units, which you can certainly achieve as the Warriors of Chaos as well. Maybe a new lore choice would be good for Tzeentch, because if you don't own the Champions of Chaos, you only get the Herald of Tzeentch. So while Chaos Sorcerer Lords are good, and Heralds are good, having a melee-focused Tzeentch Lord would be a welcome development from my perspective, and maybe giving Kairos the way of the Trickster, or maybe just some research you can acquire early on that gives you 20% or at least 10% casualty replenishment. 10% would be the minimum I would go for any campaign to make it bearable. It's not great. You will still suffer too many casualties, and it will take time to recover from those, but 10% works as a minimum. Would be nice to have more of that. Now, the specific problems for the Changeling is that while his campaign is trying to be different and unique, and to some extent Creative Assembly did succeed in that, the problem with the schemes and the ultimate scheme is that they're pretty boring. And in fact, the entire Changeling campaign is pretty boring. So I've played this campaign once. I've never seen fit to go back to it again. Because you have an army. This army is capable of curb stomping everything that lies in its path. There's nothing that's going to present any kind of real opposition against you in this particular campaign. And that's something you need to keep in mind with respect to the Changeling. That the level of challenge that you do have is going to be fairly low. I mean, you have an army that can stay invisible on the campaign map, or multiple armies that can stay invisible on the campaign map. You won't face any kind of real sense of danger or challenge. So you do get to decide the pace of the campaign. That's not necessarily the biggest problem, however. The biggest problem is the campaign dynamic. So because your economy is tied to the Mercantile Illusion, then you don't want to eliminate factions on the campaign map. It would be good to be able to, when you attack a settlement, to be able to give it to an ally when you're doing so, and also set up a cult. At the same time, I think that would add a more interesting dynamic, because you don't want to build alliances as the Changeling. Maybe odd alliances at that. But I think it would be pretty great. Like, let's say I'm attacking Kneeling. Maybe I can, raise it to the ground. But I think it would be great if I could give it to Vlad and make Vlad a really powerful ally who would be on my side in the campaign. That's just one idea, I think, about it, as opposed to the current game we have to play, where we don't have that control. You can certainly weaken a faction and potentially ally another to try and take those elements, but I just think that's one of the mechanics the Changeling would really benefit from. Would make his campaign more interesting and more dynamic, as opposed to leaving factions alive that you're at war with and never defeating them. Like for me, in my situation, in my Changeling campaign, I ended up in a war with Xiao Ming, who took control over a lot of Cathay, and he threw multiple armies against me, army after army after army, and I just at one point gave up. Not because I was losing, I'm just like, I just don't care anymore, really. Because because I wasn't defeating him, I wasn't destroying his settlements. I wanted him to be alive because I was siphoning his income, but also while increasing his income at the same time. Finally, what I would add for the Changeling himself is that when we're dealing with the Changeling, a lot of these schemes are bugged. So, for instance, in my original campaign, when dealing with Norska, I couldn't get the Northern Machinations, not the Northern Machinations, the Mutagenic Vault to necessarily work properly. Ritual combat was also bugged. So this is annoying, especially because you're aiming for the ultimate scheme to be able to, get your long campaign victory condition. So it ends up being pretty annoying when the objectives you're going for don't work. And what's really annoying as well is that you're not really facing any sense of danger, any sense of challenge in the campaign. You don't have anything at stake. I guess it does work as a troll campaign, but I think this is the least played and least enjoyable campaign out of the free ones, the free campaigns added in Shadows of Change. Like, look, Ostanka has their issues, absolutely. Yanbo, probably the most playable, but the Changeling, he's powerful. Indeed, he's an S-tier legendary lord in terms of his faction strength. Certainly one of the best, if not the best in quite a few ways, but it's just really, really dull to play. I do appreciate the intent of a more narrative-focused campaign, but I just don't think it worked well, given everything. So that's one of the things I would like Creative Assembly to take a look at. Improve the situation for Kairos from an economic standpoint. The thing about Kairos' economy to understand is that Kairos can generate a lot of money, but he does so from modifiers. So you have to build a structure that generates money, then a structure in every settlement in the province to increase, to modify that province's income to increase it. And it's annoying hassle because the structures are more expensive than other factions. You're constantly dealing with the poor casualty replenishment, and yeah, you get to deal with a lot of crap as well. Teclis and Axiatl, to be specific. The changeling is just dull, and he shouldn't be. That's where I stand on that. Finally, there is Grand Cathay. Out of the 3 races that are part of this DLC, Grand Cathay is certainly the best. They were the best before the DLC was released. They're still the best overall after the DLC, and in fact, they got the most improvements out of all the races. I do have to say that Cathay needed these improvements the least, but they certainly could have used some help. What is Creative Assembly going to add? Well, based on what I've heard, apparently they're going to add a melee hero, the Gate Guard, though that's just rumor, speculation, whatever. But they can really fix 2 problems for Cathay with that. 1, the lack of a melee hero in their roster, and 2, casualty replenishment, by adding a hero with casualty replenishment. So basically Cathay's version of the High Elven Noble, if you will, for that. That would be good. If they could add the Gate Guard as, say, a hero you can recruit at the Tier 2 barracks, that would be great. Maybe even increase capacity at Tier 2 or Tier 3. I do think it wouldn't be particularly great if we had to build up to Tier 4 in order to increase capacity besides the other 2 heroes of Cathay you can acquire at Tier 3, even if the Astromancers do require Tier 4 in order to increase capacity. Besides, with Astromancers, there are ways to get a significant amount of capacity for them in a campaign pretty quickly, in point of fact, because there is a landmark over here in the Grand Observatory, so you can be running around with 2 of them relatively quickly in a campaign. You just gotta defeat one of the most powerful legendary lords in the game, and that's Tzeentch, but that particular settlement is certainly vulnerable to attack if you're playing Xiao Ming, if you're playing Yan Bo. Less so if you're playing Miao Ying. Now, Yan Bo, I do think he's fine as a legendary lord, though I would like for his starting situation to be less annoying. It's not a bad situation, there's a lot of potential, but just the fact he starts with a ruined port, he starts with a ruined settlement. I mean, he does have 3 starting settlements, but honestly, like, even if this particular settlement was starting as under the control of the Savage Orcs, if we could get a barracks in the Isle of the Crimson Skull, that would be good. Having to use peasants from the first few turns of your campaign is not particularly great. With Cathay, I would say that I really dislike the fact that they added these negatives to Harmony. The reason they did so is because a bunch of people on Reddit, the Reddit meta was like, oh, there's no reason to not go full yin or full yang, and Harmony is pointless. As not really the case. See, the thing is, Harmony does give you that 15% income from old buildings in the settlement, and it's far easier to have Harmony than it is to go either for a significant amount of yin or yang. And you do lose out on going either full yin or yang, in the sense that, let's say you want to go full yin, well, then you're going to lose the trade exchange, which generates more money than the goods emporium. So that's not particularly great. You do need to get a lot of these yin buildings. If you want to go yang, you're going to lose the administrative center. Sure, you're going to get the lumber mill, but if you're going full yang, you're also taking a hit. So there were pros and cons. The way they redesigned the system for Shadows of Change was significantly better. Them reducing your research rate, well, right now I'm just looking at this and thinking to myself, outside of maybe going for some yang in a campaign for the sake of the recruitment capacity, there's just no reason whatsoever why I'd ever want to go for anything other than Harmony, which I think runs counter to having an interesting system in a campaign. I'm sure there's a mod out there that fixes this, but I do dislike the change they made, so I think they should revert that. Or do it perhaps in a different way. But certainly the way they handle that is not great. And like with Kislev, they have like supposedly a choice with the compass, but just like with invocations, the compass doesn't really present a choice. Right now, if you're playing a Cathay campaign, you always want to go for the Great Bastion, and when you're satisfied with the amount of casualty replenishment at 10%, you switch out to Celestial Lake, and you keep Celestial Lake as active as you can for the most part, because 15% income is a significant amount. There's very little reason to bother with the Nongchang Basin. There's very little reason to bother with any of the compass directions, including the ones that are exclusive to Yan Bo. The way I would change the compass is that I would make it so that you can fill these bars very easily. Let's say like I choose to move the compass direction towards a particular path. So you can fill them up very quickly, but they decay slowly. So let's say I would select the Great Bastion, and then, fewer turns later, I think that you should be able to change the compass faster, because campaigns in Warhammer 3 are done at a faster rate. What I would like to see personally, and this is just an idea, I would like to see, like, let's say you change the compass, but the decay wouldn't happen that easily. So it might take a full compass direction for a decay to happen from, say, 4 full bars to 3 bars, all that. I believe it does already happen right now, but the problem is, right now we have too many great effects tied to having the compass in one direction, particularly this economic benefit. So there's just no reason to not have the compass active. I think the effects should always be there if you have the bars filled up to some extent or another. That's my view. And you lose effects the more you lose these bars being filled up. So that would force you to actually use the compass in more than just 1 or 2 directions throughout the course of the campaign. Because if they add the gate guard to casualty replenishment, then quite frankly, there's no reason why you shouldn't use Celestial Lake throughout the entirety of your campaign. There should be choices, genuine choices, and you should be forced to actually use the compass to get the most amount out of it. Otherwise, it's just a pointless system. That's my view. Lower decay, do it faster. Sure, you can improve the compass, the speed at which the compass turns, but I just think that should be a baseline, and the decay should be slower, and the effect should be stronger as you fill up the bars, even if the compass is not active anymore there. That's just an idea. Let me know what you guys think. Outside of that, one thing I would like to see changed is, like, just give Cathay an ability to upgrade Jade Warriors and Jade Warrior Crossbowmen into their tier 3 versions, because it's annoying to get a bunch of Jade Warriors Crossbowmen, and you really want the ones with shields, ultimately. And you also want Halberdiers, so it's not really a great dynamic with that. But outside of that, for the most part, Cathay is in a good spot. Finally, but there is also the question of climate. Cathay is great for playing a short campaign, but a long campaign is not particularly great because of the climate limitations that do exist, the severe climate limitations that do exist in a Cathay campaign, be it unpleasant climate or uninhabitable climate. I think climate in general does need a rework, and that's one of the things I would certainly change with respect to Cathay. But these are minor issues in comparison to what Kairos and Kislev need, but just something I would change to make Cathay more enjoyable. And that would be about it. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more. And if you do enjoy my content, consider supporting me via PayPal, Patreon, YouTube channel membership, all that. See you next time.